Yeah, cool. Okay, so this is Sapphic Vampire Films, a history and exploration. So, okay, before I go too far into it, I want to have give some content warnings. A lot of these are horror and exploitation, so some of them can get very violent. There's discussions about misogyny, homophobia, lesbophobia, sexual violence, consent issues, domestic violence, and a lot of fictional bloody imagery. So if any of that concerns you anyway, just proceed with caution. Um, who am I? I'm Morgan. I'm a queer author with a BA in English Lit. My focus is mainly in British, Irish, 19th century literature, specifically Gothic literature, and I just really love vampires. So I kind of explore different sapphic vampire films throughout time, but main focus is the 70s and early 80s, where there were a slew of sapphic vampire films, mostly made in England or France. I'll go over the book Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu because a lot of these films are based on it, and I'll go into different like common themes and common tropes in these movies. So this is just not a comprehensive list of sapphic vampire films, but most of what I'm going to be covering. So Carmilla, it was published in 1872. It's a vampire horror, not a romance. It was serialized before it became a novella, and it's an again like Irish novella, and it's about a young girl who moves to Styria, which is Austria, and she's preyed upon by a lesbian vampire, and she and Carmilla, kind of gives her romantic lines, and Laura, the main character, starts to grow very ill. And so Carmilla's kind of like the aristocratic vampire archetype. You see this a lot with like Dracula, which came later, or John Polidori's The Vampire with Lord Ruthven, who is based on Lord Byron, who John Polidori was his physician, but Carmilla is thought to be an influence on Dracula. And something that's interesting about Carmilla is kind of like how it's been reclaimed, and how like I had a book club and a lot of people really resonated with like a lot of Carmilla's lines and the prose. Like one line she has is, I have been in love with no one and never shall unless it should be with you. And then another one is, if your dear heart is wounded, my wild heart bleeds with yours. In the rapture of my enormous humiliation, I live in your warm life, and you shall die. Die, sweetly die into mine. And then there's also another line she has where it's like, to die as lovers may, so that they may live together. So, like, a lot of these lines I think are very poetic and beautiful. But at the same time, at the end of the day, it's like, again, it's horror. And so it's a story about like this, like, kind of like negative homophobic stereotype about the older queer person preying on, the fair maiden or the like innocent. And so like, lesbian sexuality is infantile and narcissistic. Lesbianism is sterile and morbid. Lesbians are rich, decadent women who seduce the young and powerless. So this idea of like the wealthy, rich, queer person as a predator, or the idea that the female vampire is kind of looking for like a mirror, and it's kind of like based on vanity, which kind of leads into like Elizabeth Bathory, who was a Hungarian countess who was accused of killing young girls and women in order to bathe in their blood because she wanted to look young and beautiful. So again, like a lot of like taking the vampire and mixing it with a lot of homophobic stereotypes. And another thing before getting the films is the idea of like the male gaze and objectification, because a lot of these films are They're very beautiful, they've got great set design and music, and they're really enjoyable, but at the end of the day, a lot of them are what, like, when they get, like, criticized, they get called, like, soft porn, and there's a lot of female nudity, and, like, not all of them are directed by men, but most of them are, and so there's kind of discussion we have about, like, the objectification of women. But on the other hand, some of them, like, I would say they are sympathetic to what women deal with when they're suffering under patriarchy. And, like, a lot of them, like, the female vampire is a villain who is destroyed, but sometimes she's not. Sometimes she gets away with it. And then also kind of like the idea, like, when we talk about monsters, not just vampires, like mainly vampires are like werewolves, and how they can kind of be used to explore identity, and how people, like, a lot of times relate to the monster and find comfort in it. So those are like certain ideas to keep in mind. And something I find interesting when we look at exploitation films is, like, the idea that a work can be both transgressive and regressive at once, and it's kind of like this messy middle ground, and kind of like how do we approach, like, exploitation films and such. And also, again, a lot of these films, they're just, I mean, they're so damn cool and they're very beautiful. So yeah, like a lot of these films, especially like a lot of the ones in the 70s and 80s, they were very inspired mainly by Carmilla, but we do get some Elizabeth Bathory in there. Often we have like the female vampire, like she's kind of like on her own. She might have like an assistant who's kind of like her thrall, but mostly she's like a loner. But then a lot of times the woman she's trying to seduce is married to a man, and again, it kind of creates this problematic dichotomy of like, oh, the vampire, she's trying to seduce the woman away from what at the time they'd be like, oh, that's like the ideal, that's like the good life. A lot of these they take place in a isolated or foggy castle or manor, or like a, there's like an English countryside inn. And usually the vampire woman, she's defeated, she dies, she gets killed by a vampire hunter or like a husband or something. And sometimes if she manages to change the woman she's seducing, the woman will also die as well. So first up, we got Dracula's Daughter, which was directed by Lambert Hillier, and it's a sequel to Todd Browning's Dracula. So the main vampire Maria is the daughter of Bela Lugosi's Dracula. Which, fun fact, I actually learned like an hour ago that this is the day that Bela Lugosi died. So that was not intentional at all. So Maria, she's played by Gloria Holden, and she's kind of portrayed it in the first half as like she wants a normal life. She kind of resents being a vampire. She actually wants to kill her dad because he's the one who turned, like, I think it's like hereditary, and so she's like, if I kill him, then I can have a normal life. However, as it progresses, she gives into her bloodlust, which is pretty much exclusively her going out after, women and attacking women. Like a woman she was going to paint, and implied that it was going to be a nude painting. And the climax, she kidnaps a woman, I believe it is the doctor's assistant, and then she gets killed by her jealous manservant who wanted to be turned to a vampire. So some trivia about this is Gloria Holden. She was kind of down on the movie, and kind of like didn't really like that she got cast in it, because she saw how Bela Lugosi kind of got typecast when he was Dracula, so she worried that would happen to her. And also, a lot of people kind of viewed horror as like, low brow. But another interesting thing about this is that Anne Rice was very much inspired by this movie. So, and also like a scene that I like really sticks with me near the end is when she has her the woman she's kidnapped, and the woman's like asleep laying down. There's a scene where she's going to go bite her, and the way it's shot, and it really lingers on this scene, and like it looks like she's going to kiss her. So that was kind of like look kind of like the earliest Sapphic one, and so then, but when we really get into the 70s, this is where there's like a whole bunch of them. And so we start with The Vampire Lovers, which is a Hammer horror film. And it was directed by Roy Ward Baker. And it's actually the first in a trilogy, which I haven't seen the other two, I don't think. And while with like Dracula's Daughter, we can go, well, it's maybe subtext. Like here, it's not subtextual at all. Like there is like there is an actual like kind of like seduction and a lot of female nudity in this one. And it's Carmilla, who's played by Ingrid Pitt, who was in a very, very popular in Hammer horror films. She played Elizabeth Bathory in Countess Dracula, and so she's seducing a much younger woman, and she's hunted and killed by not Van Helsing. He's played by Peter Cushing, and so he's basically the Van Helsing without actually being literally Van Helsing. And so the things I want to note about this movie is it again like much older woman preying on a younger woman who's very much portrayed as like an ingenue, very innocent. Like it's definitely leaning to those very like bad negative stereotypes. But I will say though, like as a movie, like it's very watchable and the acting is good. I think about like most of the movies, this one has like amazing like gothic set design and the costuming and the color and the just the technicolor and how the colors pop. It's just like really well done. And also like with these movies, you kind of get some of them behind the scenes things weren't like that great, but here it was like they did try to be like conscious of like the women's comfort, and so whenever there were nude scenes, the set was close to male producers, so they were kind of conscious of their comfort. And also I just love these posters that they would make. The left one kind of confuses me where she's like green and intimidating a almost naked guy, but I just love like the vibe. I like how colorful they are. And then this is the Italian one. Again, I really like the vibe. I think is very cool. And so the next, this is one that was very successful. We get Daughters of Darkness, which was directed by Harry Kumel in Belgium, and the setting is this like very lush, like oceanside hotel, and the plot, which you see a lot in kind of like movies that came out after it, is that there's an unhappy newlywed couple, and like the husband is abusive and they go here, but they end up encountering Elizabeth Bathory and her quote unquote secretary, and of course her and the female lead kind of have this like bond and this attraction going on. And a big thing that works in this movie is Delphine Seyrig as Bathory. Because her wardrobe choices in almost every scene are just like so vibrant and really cool. And one of my favorites is in the climax, she basically like wears this dress that I call the disco ball dress, because it's a room that's just filled with all these tall candles, and as she's moving around it's just glittering. It also kind of feels like it's almost like her armor. So I just think that was a really cool wardrobe design choice. And so like the marriage is not just unhappy, there is abuse and rape and that happens. And Valerie even tries to escape, and but Elizabeth stops her. And it's kind of like this kind of mixed thing where it's like her desire for Elizabeth is almost like liberation, but then at the same time what Elizabeth wants is she wants to possess her, so it's not really. And then another thing that I found curious about this film is how it depicts homosexuality, like not just with like women, but with men. And Stefan, the husband, because he's depicted as very like immature and volatile, but he also keeps talking about like it kind of gives me kind of Norman Bates vibes, where he talks about his mother a lot. There's this figure he calls mother, but there's a scene where he gets on the phone and it's revealed that Mother is actually a much older man who he's like lounging in a hammock. He's got like a scarf and makeup on, and he's, you know, kind of obviously being coded as like a much older gay man. And so I wasn't, and this isn't really something that like gets followed up on or is like seen as like this huge deal. But at the same time, it feels like maybe they're like trying to like the same way like with lesbian vampire, like, oh, or like how people will be like, oh, like it's a phase you grow out of once you mature. It's like, is it trying to frame like Stefan as like he's like closeted and that's why he has these issues and so it's kind of homophobic. The thing is, I can't really tell you. I can't really tell you what they intended. But end of the movie, the good news is that the abusive husband dies, but also the bad news is that the awesome lady vampire also dies. And then in a very dramatic way, there's a car explosion, everything. But another thing about this movie is that there was like on-set tension and violence behind the scenes. The director hit the female lead. They got into an argument and he hit her, and then the guy who played Stefan came over and he punched the director in the face. So it was not like a very good environment. Like it was not a good working environment. But this movie was extremely successful and it made, producers going down like in different places be like, okay, we want our, Sapphic vampire movie. And so we get The Velvet Vampire, which was directed by Stephanie Rothman, and she got her start. She was hired to be an assistant to Roger Corman, and she, including with this movie, she co-wrote it with her husband. And so basically, producers everywhere in like Europe and America are like, okay, we want our own like Sapphic vampire movie. That's because we want it to be successful, like Daughters of Darkness, and so she went to making it. And so the plot again is very much like the others. It starts with a newlywed couple, Lee and Susan, but like a difference in this one is that it's very bisexual. Like the vampire kind of like desires them both, and her name is Diane LaFonu, which is of course a reference to Sheridan LaFonu. And another thing interesting is that this is the only one that takes place in a desert. It's very like American West Gothic in a way that I find is very cool, even though at first I was kind of like, this is like not what I was expecting. But unfortunately, with this movie, it had a very like disappointing like test audiences didn't really like it. It didn't really make much money. Corman didn't really have much faith in it, and he mentioned he was disappointed in it. And so that plus like Roger Corman had a reputation for like hiring more women than was usual at the time, and he was seen as very progressive. But at the same time, he was also known for like the way they word is, oh, he was cautious with money, but basically he paid everybody very low. And Stephanie Rothman, like with her and her husband, she's like, okay, we need to make a living, so we can't stay here. So she ended up leaving and not working with Corman anymore and working on other films. So a thing that's interesting to me about this movie in particular is some of when Stephanie Rothman was interviewed about it. She said it was rare for anyone who did not have family connections to find employment in the film industry, in or outside of the jurisdiction of the labor unions. It was even rarer for a woman to be hired. It was traditional to exclude us from nearly all types of work behind the camera. And so when discussing, what her intention with this film, said Rothman wanted to make the vampire female and have a woman as a protagonist rather than the victim. I always thought a vampire was a very erotic figure, and I wanted to make a highly erotic vampire who was appealing and very seductive and was a modern woman. And then the actor who played the vampire. Celeste Yarnell, like, she was kind of having difficulties because she had just given birth, but she said when working on the film, everyone was very accommodating, just a joy to work with. Stephanie was wonderful, open. It was my first experience having a female director, and it was remarkable, especially concerning the sexual scenes. Stephanie was very sensitive. She closed the set during the more explicit shots, and there was often just Michael and I and the cameraman. And then although she did, Rothman did say this was a difficult film to work on. Like, she kind of didn't really like working on exploitation movies, and also because it was the desert, there were so many like cacti that they kept brushing up against, which is of course very unpleasant. But she also said, I'm very tired of the whole tradition in Western art in which women are always presented nude and men aren't. I'm not going to dress women and undress men. That would be a form of tortured vengeance. But I certainly am going to undress men, and the result is probably a more healthy environment because one group of people presenting another in a vulnerable, weaker, more servile position is always distorted. So that's something I really liked about the Velvet Vampires, kind of like this more equal footing when it comes to like, well, it's an exploitation movie, so of course there's going to be nudity, but we're not just going to do it with the women. And so, The Shiver of the Vampires, but this is directed by Jean Rollin, who he basically made his whole career off doing like Sapphic vampire films. And what can I say about this movie besides it's the number one movie of all time? It's got pretty much everything that I want in a movie. It's part of the fantastique genre, so the plot's kind of loose. It's kind of similar, like, married couple come into this castle and they encounter a female vampire. There's a lot of surrealism, and a lot of times the dialogue, it can kind of feel non sequitur at times, but it's very poetic. And sometimes in these films, there's not much dialogue at all. Like in Requiem for a Vampire, directed by him, they don't speak for the first 40 minutes of that movie, but it's very dreamlike and erotic. The soundtrack is banger. I love the soundtrack. It's very prog rock, very early 70s. Again, it's interesting because the female vampire, she's very like, if you look at the way she's dressed, it's very hippie inspired. So, but anyway, cinema peaked here. I love this movie, and again, like what it does with color and like reds and purples, I just really enjoy it. Like, it's just a delight to watch. So after that, we got the blood spattered, not splattered, the blood spattered bride, and this is a Spanish movie. It was directed by Vincente Aranda in fascist Spain. This was 3 years before Franco died, and so it's heavily based on Carmilla, the vampires Carmilla, and it kind of reminds me a lot of like a Giallo, like those Italian slasher movies. It's kind of very dreamlike, but a lot of the shot composition is really good. And basically, it's a woman named Susan, and she marries this like very like domineering man who's very much like, this is the role of men, this is your role as a woman, and you're going to do as I say. And so, like, and she starts having like violent dreams, and also like she doesn't climax when they sleep together, and he's like, well, what's wrong with her? She clearly has some medical condition, we need to get her a doctor. And but then she starts falling in love with Carmilla, and she gets changed into a vampire. But unfortunately, the husband kills both of them at the end. But he is arrested for the murder. So this one is interesting because it was made during a fascist regime, and homosexuality was illegal. You would go to prison for it. But and it seems like it's kind of like in the vein of the chauvinistic hyper masculine figure. He's the hero and he kills the evil lesbian vampires. But like, when I did research on it, the director, he was anti-fascist, and something that really strikes me is that throughout the entire movie, like, Susan is portrayed as highly sympathetic. Like, you're not supposed to sympathize with the husband, you're supposed to, like, sympathize with her and her position and, like, how horrible it is. So my argument would be is, it's a shame that it ends, the way it does, but at the same time, and at the time in Spain, you couldn't really do this like very, feminist queer film. So I think ultimately you're supposed to and again, the husband does get punished. He gets arrested for what he did. He doesn't get away with it. So I think ultimately you're supposed to, feel for Susan and her plight as, a queer woman living in a fascist country. So, vampires. This is a fun one. It was directed by Jose Ramon Larez and a super small budget. It got censored in the UK, which is called the Vatican edition, and so basically the plot of it is you have these two bisexual women, and they open up like they're being intimate in bed, and the husband comes in and he's really angry by what he finds and he kills them, and so they haunt this inn that they're at. And so like it's a very loose plot. It's very much they go around mostly killing men together but also women, and but they are a couple. And again, like a huge thing about this one is, typically the vampire or the woman she turns, like they either one dies or they both die. But in this one, they actually get away with it. It shows them running through the cemetery, like they get to escape. So they get to escape together. So which we love to see that. We love to see two murderous queens make it out. So but this one was not well received. It was seen like, oh, they made the men masochistic props for the women to kill, and they criticized, the kind of the lack of a strong plot and all that. But I had a lot of fun with this one personally. And then so Rowland, he made a lot of these films. This is like probably my second favorite after the Shiver of the Vampires. It's much later than the Shiver of the Vampires, and it was technically his most successful work because there are a lot of producers behind it. And but like a funny thing about this one is they wanted a zombie movie. They were like, we want a zombie movie because those are making money. And he was just like, what if I make her like a zombie vampire lesbian? So the lore is kind of like this mix of vampire and zombie, which I find very cool. And of course there's this like chemistry she has with her childhood friend who offers her food, like a dead bird and such. And I don't know, I just found it like very strangely touching. And yeah, I really of his work, because I've seen quite a few of his movies. I think this one is my second favorite. So and again, there are certain movies I didn't quite touch on in depth, but are there any like contemporary films nowadays that are similar to these kind of older Sapphic vampire films? And the very short answer is yes. And so this is where I make the argument that Jennifer's Body is actually a Sapphic vampire movie. So stay with me on this one. So it's directed by Karen Kusama, and it's also one of the best movies ever. I love this movie. I had a friend who was like, "Oh, I've never seen it before," and like they're a lesbian. They watch a lot of lesbian movies. I'm like, "Oh, I've never seen this one," and I'm like, "No, you have to watch it. You have to watch it." So we watched it together, and I remember them being like, "Did," because the screenplay is done by Diablo Cody, and I remember them being like, Did people in high school like talk like this back in those days?" And I was like, "No, but still, I love it." So I would argue, so Jennifer is like she's so when, after she's killed, she comes back as a succubus, a demon. But like a lot of the mythology of like a succubus or an incubus where they like sit on someone's chest at night and they give them nightmares and stuff. A lot of that is kind of missing. The only thing that's kind of there is that she does like seduce, like she tricks men and like seduces them so she can get them alone and kill them. But well, one, I feel like there's an emphasis on like the like she does eat flesh, but there's also an emphasis on like the blood drinking. Like when she has that one guy, the goth guy in the abandoned house. There's like her like cupping her hands to drink his blood. And another like big thing for me is that yeah, and there's like this huge emphasis on her feeding. Like she has to feed to like she looks sickly and the idea is like, oh, not as beautiful. It's just kind of like she's kind of objectified constantly by other characters out the film, and so she's kind of obsessed with her beauty, so she like has to consume to stay looking healthy. And also another big thing is the way she dies is that when the main character Needy kills her, she stakes her, which is very vampiric. Like, yeah, she uses a box cutter to stab her through the heart. So, that's my thesis, is that I feel like even if she is technically a demon, like, and also like in stuff like Buffy the Vampire Slayer and a lot of lore, like demon and vampire is kind of like intermingled. Like a vampire is like almost like a kind of demon. So my big thesis is that like this shares a lot of blood of vampire movies, and so I would say it's extremely close to these kind of like older movies. And another thing I like about this movie is how it's called Jennifer's Body, and if you saw like a lot of the marketing back when it was like first getting released, there's all of this emphasis on like the sexualization of Megan Fox, but the actual movie is like kind of critiquing her objectification. The way she's shot by the camera is never like exploitative like you might expect. And another thing, like, about the Sapphic element is that the core of this movie to me is Needy and Jennifer's relationship. They do kiss on screen, and Jennifer alludes to, oh, they used to do like boyfriend girlfriend, like they used to play at boyfriend girlfriend and when they would have sleepovers. But ultimately, Needy, she's tied to Jennifer's humanity, and she's the one person who very consistently sees Jennifer as a person, even though their relationship is very like toxic and codependent, which like Needy's boyfriend points out. But like when Jennifer dies and she's stabbed in the middle of her chest, she says her last words are my tits. So this kind of idea that she associates what Needy's doing with her breasts, again, like being objectified, but Needy responds, no, your heart. So again, like Needy is not objectifying her. She's not like even the way like Jennifer has been kind of taught to like use her own sexuality and maybe like see yourself in a certain way. Like Needy, focuses like no, that like it's your heart. And another one, this one is very different from pretty much all the other films, but I thought I would mention it. So there is a Carmilla adaptation that came out in 2019, which is directed by Emily Harris, and it's extremely toned down. And a big thing about this one that surprised me is that it's not a vampire movie. It's just a movie about two teenage girls who fall in love and they try to run away together, but basically Carmilla, she gets accused of being a vampire, so she does get staked and killed. But the big twist is that she was never a vampire. It was just homophobia and like these older adults kind of like tearing them apart because of their bigotry. And so yeah, so it's extremely bleak and sad movie. It's not really like it was a good movie. It's not really my cup of tea, but like I really appreciate like the themes that it was trying to explore. And so, like other Sapphic vampire films, and there are even more that aren't listed here, but Blood and Roses. Juan Lopez Moctezuma is a Mexican director. He did Alucarda and Mary, Mary, Bloody Mary, which are both pretty good. They can be a little hard to follow, but they're both pretty good. Alucarda is like it's lesbian, vampire, satanic, nunsploitation. So if that's up your alley, then I would recommend it. Like again, it's kind of problematic. I didn't really like the representation of like a Romani character in it, like the way that character was treated, but it's still a very interesting film to watch. Most of John Rollins' filmography, he's got a lot more than what I've already mentioned. And then Tony Scott's The Hunger is really good. So Tony Scott, he's most known for Top Gun. I mostly think of him as like action movies, but he released this very queer vampire movie with is Catherine Deneuve, and she's like this ancient vampire, and she has David Bowie as her boyfriend, which I found interesting because normally it's the female vampire is alone and she's like kind of preying on this established couple, but here is the vampire like she has an established couple, but they're not kind of getting along very well, and she ends up cheating on him with Susan Sarandon. So like this one and the kind of like the gender play in it, I find to be very fun. So in conclusion, mostly in the 70s and 80s, there were a lot of sapphic vampire films, especially after Daughters of Darkness was successful, and a lot of them are surreal and heavily erotic and experimental, and a lot of them kind of had these negative stereotypes and this objectification, but also a lot of them explored interesting themes and topics. So that's about all I have for you. So, question, thoughts, favorite sapphic vampire movies. I'm happy to hear it.